When you're preparing a benefit cost analysis, you'll need to prepare a year-by-year budget for the life of the project. And in doing that, it matters which year a cost is incurred in, for reasons that will become clear in a later video on discounting. There are various types of costs that you'll need to factor in. Beyond just the costs of the project, the upfront phase of the project implementation, you'll also need to think about private costs, costs that are not borne by the project organisation, operating or maintenance costs, which are ongoing after the end of the initial project, and opportunity costs of capital, which again we'll cover in the topic on discounting. Project costs have a number of different components. Many initiatives have an initial project phase which is relatively high in cost because they're building something or purchasing something, fixing something, doing research, doing education. And in this phase, in this initial project phase, cash will be required for various purposes, such as for the time of the people who are employed to implement and manage the project, for cars, fuel, equipment and so on. It may be required for payments to encourage behaviour change, and in some projects it'll be needed for legal costs, office space, insurance, publicity, that sort of thing. There could also be in-kind costs provided by the project organisation to cover costs that are not fully covered by the project cash. This could include things like staff salaries, administrative support, office space and so on, and these are real costs which should be factored into the benefit cost analysis. They're just as relevant as cash costs because these resources have an opportunity cost. If they weren't used for this project, they could have generated benefits in some other way. Then there are private costs, and this is the costs to other people, not the project organisation, of contributing their time, resources or other inputs. If this is contributed voluntarily, the private costs should only be included in the benefit cost analysis if the private benefits are also included. Sometimes it's reasonable to assume that the voluntary private costs and the private benefits cancelled out so that you can just ignore the private costs. But sometimes private costs are not voluntary, in which case you really shouldn't be ignoring them. In this case, it could be that people are having to comply with a regulation that's put in place by the project or the policy that we're evaluating. This should be calculated as the change in the private net benefit with versus without the project. And this should consider any private benefits that result from the project as well, not just the costs. If there are benefits, they need to be factored in. And we should include this in the calculations for as long as the regulations persist beyond the initial project phase. Here's a bit of a technical note. When we calculate the benefit cost ratio, any private costs, including compliance costs, would need to be subtracted from the benefits rather than added to the costs in order to get a valid ranking of the different projects from our benefit cost ratios. After the project phase, most projects require some ongoing funding. For example, we might have a project to build a water treatment plant, and then there would be ongoing funding required to operate and maintain the plant. Or another example could be a project might restore a natural area, in which case we will need ongoing funding to maintain the natural area, such as removing feral invaders, managing fire, and maintaining facilities. These maintenance and operating costs can be quite important. They can constitute a large proportion of the total costs of a project. But they may be borne by different people or organisations other than the project organisation. But if so, they still need to be factored into the benefit cost analysis. The reason that these are important to factor in is that benefits may be reduced or lost if ongoing costs are not borne. These ongoing costs might last for only a few years beyond the end of the initial project, or they might last forever. And as I say, they can be quite big. They can even exceed the initial project costs in some cases. Key points. A year-by-year budget is required for the life of the project to calculate the costs. And it needs to include project cash costs for equipment, fuel, salaries, legal costs and so on. It needs to include any project in-kind costs, which are outside the project cash budget. It may need to include private costs if that's relevant, particularly if they're not borne voluntarily, and it probably needs to include maintenance and operating costs.